Allow me to welcome you in the name of the Puravut Center for the Study of the Iranian World, the Program of Iranian Studies at the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, and the Kotsin Institute of Archaeology, which is generously hosting us in its Loki today, to the 10th Ehsan Yarshater lecture series at UCLA, to be held by my esteemed colleague, Professor Daniel Potts, on Kith and Kin, Tribe and State in Ancient Iran. Before proceeding with a proper introduction of our speaker today, I would like to provide some background on the Yarshater lecture series and acknowledge the eponymous founder, the late Professor Yarshater, whose memorial we observed just last year at UCLA. The venerable doctoral program for Iranian studies, wherein the entire range of the Iranian experience, from pre-Islamic Iran to the classical age were taught, have always consisted of a pleiad of institutions, notably the programs established at Harvard University in 1957 by Richard Fry, at UCLA in 1963, at Columbia in 1968 by Yarshater himself, and in Paris in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, at a host of institutions such as l'Institut des études iraniennes at the Sorbonne, le Centre national des recherches scientifiques de Collège de France, and la délégation archéologique française en Iran, led by such luminaries as Louis Massignon, René Labarre, Henri Corbin, and Émile Benveniste. There is no doubt that an esprit de corps and academic reciprocity have characterized the exchanges between these eminent programs. And it was thus consequent, as a means further to strengthen dialogue in Iranology, that the Yarshater lecture series would almost simultaneously be established at Harvard, UCLA, and the Sorbonne in the past decades by Professor Yarshater himself. With all things ancient Iranian being now happily defunct at Harvard, the Yarshater lecture series are now only held at UCLA and the Collège de France. The Yarshater lecture series were inspired by Les Leçons au Collège de France and are delivered by a distinguished scholar whose work has lastingly impacted the study of the Iranian civilization. Each series consists of 4 to 5 lectures on a single theme that is subsequently elaborated and amplified into a monograph. The lectures thus represent original research and synthesis in all aspects of Iranian studies. We are hence exceedingly honored that the 10th Biennial Ehsan Yarshater lecture series would be held by our eminent colleague, Professor Daniel Potts, whose intellectual werdegang I would strive to summarize as succinctly as possible, which, however, in view of the immensity of his publication, might be an impossibility. Dr. Potts is Professor of Ancient Near Eastern Archaeology and History at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, ISO, at New York University. He's a thorough product of Harvard, having received both his AB in 1975 and his PhD in 1980 there, the latter from the Department of Anthropology with a specialty in Near Eastern Archaeology. Dan and I have this in common, although I did not have the privilege of being his contemporary while at Harvard, that our academic advisors who worked on either side of the Divinity Ave in Cambridge believed in the philosophical maxim of après moi le déluge and managed to retire from the positions, now happily defunct, almost in time for our own retirement. Before joining ISO, Professor Potts taught previously at the Freie Universität Berlin, the University of Copenhagen, and the University of Sydney, where he held the Edwin Cuthbert Hall Chair of Middle Eastern Archaeology. This is really a mouthful, I must say. His main areas of interest are Greater Iran, Mesopotamia, and the Persian Gulf, and as a field archaeologist, he has conducted numerous excavations, among others in Iran and Turkey. He's a corresponding member of the German Archaeological Institute and ISMIO, in addition of being a fellow at the Australian Academy of Humanities. Professor Potts belongs to that rare breed of historians of the ancient Near East and the ancient world, whose work are distinguished by their great capaciousness and ability to control simultaneously a varied material culture and equally diverse textual testimonies, who know all that is to be known, from minute artifacts to most arcane publications, on the strength of which they reconstitute the outline of a connected cultural expanse which spans across linguistic and cultural boundaries. Thus, for him, the world of ancient Iran, Mesopotamia, and the Persian Gulf, as well as Central Asia, are so profoundly intertwined that we have to move beyond more rudimentary notions of exchanges and connections. But aside his generous notions of space, he remains one of the few, truly few, who command over the diachrony. He's equally at ease with the antique world of the Elamites in the 3rd millennium, BC, obviously, and as he is with the Sasanians in late antiquity, writing, inspiring, and crossing swords with specialized scholars gallantly and persuasively. His extraordinary publications are a testimony to his vertiginous versatility. His work is way too multifaceted for me to attempt an introduction at this juncture. Suffice it to say, his writings, beginning with his classical monograph on Elam, the archaeology of Elam, formation and transformation of an ancient Iranian state, now in a second revised edition with Cambridge University Press, is a must for all students of ancient Iran and Elam, and exquisitely illustrates not only his ability to command over archaeological data and manifold literary traditions, cuneiform, classical, and Iranian, capacity critically to assess or innovatively to synthesize them, but more importantly, shows his perspective on historical diachrony, allowing us to witness the continuity and transformation of a cultural expanse or phenomena over millennia. Of moment is also his grand and sweeping synthesis on nomadism in Iran that investigates the role of nomadism from prehistory through the late 20th century Iran, and once again exhibits his mastery of the sources, both material culture and documentary, to challenge our thinking on the phenomenon of nomadism by clearly demonstrating that its arrival on the Iranian plateau is to be radically rethought. Numerous are his other monographs, articles, and edited volumes on archaeology, historiography, methodological discourse, and more. But since they all are a major source of despair to me, and sympathizing others who in vain strive to catch up reading them, and moreover, since reviewing them would require at least 5 leçons by itself, I shall just refer to his bibliography, which I had the delight to reduce myself to half a page with much schadenfreude. In his lecture today, Money is to the West what kinship is to the rest, the first installment of 5 investigations into the archaeology and philology of kinship ties, king and kingship ties in the longue durée of Iranian antiquity, he shall be discussing why kinship is an important, albeit often overlooked aspect of the ancient Iranian society, as well as presenting some key concepts in kinship analysis. So I think I've arrived finally to my last page. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Potts. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, Rahim, thank you so much. One of these days I will repay the favor. Your bibliography is not exactly slim. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, invitations undoubtedly have different effects on different people. To say that I am deeply honored to have been invited to deliver these lectures is an understatement. For although I'm neither a student of Persian literature nor Iranian linguistics, I was privileged to spend some precious hours with Professor Yarshater in his apartment and at the Encyclopedia Iranica offices in New York over the past 2 decades, occasionally having lunch with him and talking about Iran. Despite my focus on some very different aspects of ancient Iran than those in which he was most interested, he could not have been kinder to me in all of our interactions, both in person and via email. But in addition to reflecting on Professor Yarshater, the invitation to deliver a series of lectures bearing his name prompted another kind of retrospection. The intellectual history of any field, if one takes a serious interest in it, is analogous to the night sky, each star representing a scholar who has come before and made some contribution, whether great or small, to the field. The brightest stars in the firmament, so to speak, of course, are the giants of the field. Scarcely a day goes by when I do not consult the work of one or more of those giants. Everyone's list of such scholars will vary according to their particular fields of interest. But in my own case, it contains a host of universalists who combined every species of historical inquiry using epigraphic and literary sources in a dozen languages, geographical and historical data, numismatic and archaeological evidence, to address complicated problems that few of us nowadays possess the wherewithal to tackle without constant recourse to secondary sources. I can think of dozens of intellectual companions in ancient Iranian studies who were never very far from my thoughts. Scholars like Friedrich Karl Andreas, Wilhelm Ehlers, Alfred von Gutschmidt, Walter Bruno Henning, Ernst Herzfeld, Albert Hutum Schindler, A.V. Williams Jackson, Ferdinand Justi, Josef Marquardt, Vladimir Minorsky, Theodor Noldeke, William Owsley, Henry Rawlinson, Vincent Scheil, Mark Aurel Stein, Wilhelm Tomaszek, Rudiger Schmidt, and Rand Zadok. So of course they all crowded my mind when I began to seriously consider the prospect of delivering these lectures. And what could be more intimidating than to stand, metaphorically speaking, opposite such an array of extraordinary scholars and contemplate how in the world one was going to bring something worthy to this series? Well, one obvious ploy would be to concentrate on historical evidence and archaeological excavations that post-date the lifetimes of these Olympians. Yet, in my experience, even when new evidence appears, as it does all the time, the minute one seeks to integrate that with what is already known, one finds scholars of the past 2 or 3 centuries who have already dealt in some fashion with many of the same problems raised by the new data. I have chosen to focus on kinship and social organization in these lectures because I have repeatedly observed that as great as all of the previously mentioned scholars may have been, there is room in this domain to say something new and different. To be sure, there have been studies which look at individuals in relation to Elamite law, the institution of levirate marriage, the sister's son in Elamite royal titulature and succession, matrilinearity in Elam, Achaemenid tribes, Achaemenid, Arsacid, and Sasanian noble families, the social and economic position of women, marriage, and the question of incest and close kin marriage more generally. All of these topics will be touched on in the coming lectures because there is yet more to be said on them. Studies explicitly devoted to kinship systems, on the other hand, are notably few and far between. And yet, as the American anthropologist Marshall Sahlins observed in 1976, from which I took the title for this talk, "Money is to the West what kinship is to the rest." Even though this is a very glib, almost tongue-in-cheek throwaway line, Sahlins' observation encapsulates the widely perceived difference in the standing of kinship in Western versus non-Western societies, and the underlying assumption, whether justified or not, that so-called traditional societies are more tightly unified by ties of kinship than Western, urbanized, and industrialized ones are. While I think this dichotomy is far too reductionist, I am, of course, not concerned in these lectures with modern social formations, but with ancient Iranian ones. Traditionally, the study of kinship has been the domain of social anthropologists and sociologists, who, unlike archaeologists and ancient historians, can actually interview their informants. Kinship is far more complex than it might at first glance seem, however, for it is less about biological relationships than socially constructed ones. As A.R. Radcliffe Brown and Darrell Ford noted in 1950, two persons who are kin are related in one or other of two ways. Either one is descended from the other, or they are both descended from a common ancestor. But descent is first and foremost, quote, the social relationship of parents and children, not the physical relation. The impossibility of speaking to those whose kinship categories and systems we might wish to study has undoubtedly kept many historians, philologists, and archaeologists from devoting much time to the topic. Yet there is plenty of evidence in the ancient sources, as I hope to show, of kinship relations in different ancient Iranian settings. And in these lectures, I shall try to demonstrate that this evidence only makes sense when it is treated like any other body of ethnographic data and interpreted in light of the innumerable anthropological studies that have been published in the course of the past 150 years. Unavoidably, I shall also show when and how a diametrically opposed stance has been adopted by some scholars in the past, who have openly and almost proudly avowed an unwillingness to consult relevant anthropological literature for insights into ancient kinship systems. Needless to say, this has often led to ill-informed interpretations, some of which have lingered in the literature for decades, that could have been avoided in many instances by consulting the relevant anthropological literature. To cite just one example, in 1926, I'll cite plenty of them during the lectures. To cite just one example, in 1926, a year in which the likes of Franz Boas, A.R. Radcliffe Brown, Bronislaw Malinowski, Robert Lowy, Alfred Kroeber, and a host of other extraordinarily important social anthropologists were active, Friedrich Wilhelm Koenig had the temerity to proudly declare, in a study of alleged Elamite matrilinearity, that he had intentionally resisted any impulse to draw ethnographic parallels amongst other cultures that might bear on the issue, for he felt it more correct to first extract everything that the, quote, sources had to offer that was possible. Then and only then, when his conclusions were firmly based on the Elamite evidence, could he and should he present comparisons with other cultures, which no doubt he felt would show things in a different light. To do otherwise, he said, would only prejudice his understanding of the Elamite evidence. Notwithstanding the reluctance of Koenig and others of his ilk to engage with the anthropological literature in seeking to understand kin relations in ancient Iran, it is presumably obvious to all of us that people are the actors in history, and we don't really need the prosopographical studies of ancient historians, the multiple career line analyses of sociologists, or the collective biographies of modern historians to validate this premise. Nor should it be the case that the consultation of comparable evidence in other times and places necessarily corrupts one's understanding of a particular historical phenomenon. This is tantamount to ignoring all precedents pertaining to a particular law in legal or judicial practice. In fact, I cannot think of a situation in which we shouldn't apply exactly the opposite approach and scour the literature for similar expressions of a particular social practice, making every effort to understand it to the best of our abilities. A further problem is endemic to the study of the ancient world. Because archaeologists and art historians tend to study material culture, and philologists tend to study literary and epigraphic sources, things like ceramic shapes and decoration, architecture, iconography, grammar, phonology, and loanwords often assume lives of their own and become, as objects of study, ends in themselves, leaving little time and space to draw conclusions about the people who created them. Similarly, the nature of the available ancient written sources in and about Iran means that although they might wish it otherwise, ancient Near Eastern historians have often, faute de mieux, given military, political, and religious history priority over other fields. There are exceptions, of course. Some economic historians have been at pains to stress the importance of family relationships and trading concerns, for example. Yet by and large, this sort of study is the exception rather than the rule. And my decision to devote my Yarshater lectures to kinship and society is a reflection of a very basic desire to get at the people who made the artifacts and who used the loanwords that we study, not necessarily as individual actors, but as members of kinship units or social groups. This is what motivates me to examine Iranian archaeology and history in the light of kinship and modes of social organization. In prioritizing the people behind the artifacts, the kinship system behind the stele, or the society behind the archive, I'm only doing what others have long advocated. For example, more than 60 years ago, in his obituary of the prehistorian V. Gordon Childe, Robert J. Braidwood famously wrote, quote, "Although Childe loved the artifacts he could understand, he never forgot, quote, the Indian behind the artifact, and scolded his colleagues roundly if they did. For example," he wrote, "Mengen insists so strongly on an axe as an expression of a historical tradition that the readers may forget that it is an implement for felling trees. Actually, Braidwood's choice of this quotation was perhaps maladroit, for it would seem to warn against forgetting the functional, technical purpose of an artifact, rather than paying attention to the social context in which it was manufactured or the craftsman or craftswoman who made it. In any case, for the Austrian prehistorian Oswald Mengen's name here, I could easily substitute the names of a multitude of archaeologists and art historians specializing in ancient Iran, who, like Child, loved their cylinder seals, ceramics, rock reliefs, silver vessels, statuary, and inscriptions, but like Mengen, often ignore the people who fashioned or used them. By contrast, in the words of the Michigan anthropological archaeologist Kent Flannery, quote, "The process theorist is not ultimately concerned with the Indian behind the artifact, but rather with the system behind both the Indian and the artifact." To be very clear, nobody who's ever read a word I've written would classify me as a process theorist. But I am interested in systems, albeit social rather than processual ones. But let us also be realistic. We are, after all, dealing with periods, the youngest of which is well over a millennium old. Therefore, what we can expect to reveal at the level of kinship and social organization is almost necessarily fragmentary and shadowy, the fragments of a web of social relations, rather than links in a well-preserved chain of kinship relationships. What I shall try to do in the next 2 weeks may occasionally resemble historical anthropology, anthropological history, or retrospective ethnography, although since Charles Tilly characterized this approach as one which seeks to recreate crucial situations of the past as a thoughtful participant observer would have experienced them, then it is clear that my own endeavor is nothing of the kind. My aim is simply to highlight those kinship, familial, and social structures, however poorly they may be represented in the written archaeological record, that have tended to be sidelined or, if acknowledged at all, misunderstood in previous studies of ancient Iran. Before beginning on the substance of these lectures, however, I'd like to say a few words about the scope and chronology of them. Iran is much more than a toponym. As Gerardo Gnoli showed so eloquently over 30 years ago, Iran is first and foremost an idea. No matter how much one parses the nomenclature of the Sasanian and Achaemenid royal inscriptions or the classical sources on Persia, however, Iran remains an utterly anachronistic term in the discussion of any period prior to the appearance of the Achaemenid Empire and the first Iranian speakers slightly earlier in the early to mid-first millennium BC. Mesopotamian cuneiform sources abound in toponyms to the east of the Tigris, and while only a relatively small number of these can be located with confidence, they leave us in no doubt that the area occupied today by the Islamic Republic of Iran was culturally diverse and anything but unified. To be sure, some regions were larger than others, but the only thing they have in common with Iran as we know it is their location east of the Tigris, north of the Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea, south of the Caucasus, the Caspian Sea and the plains of Turkmenistan, and west of the mountains of Afghanistan and eastern Baluchistan. In other words, to use the term Iranian when discussing the archaeology and early history of the regions falling within the boundaries of modern Iran is to adopt a convention, and an anachronistic one at that. No Marhashian prince of the 3rd millennium BC, Elamite scribe of the 2nd millennium BC, or Median chieftain of the 1st millennium BC would have understood the term Iran. When, therefore, archaeologists and historians categorize a particular site and its finds, or a particular region as Iranian, this reflects an underlying assumption about what may or may not be included under this rubric that almost always reflects the modern boundaries of the nation-state of Iran rather than any form of cultural unity. And so ingrained have these boundaries become in our conception of Iran since the early 19th century that it is inordinately difficult to escape their strictures. Chronologically, therefore, all periods prior to the appearance of the first individuals in cuneiform sources with etymologically Iranian names can be considered pre-Iranian. And yet Iranian archaeology, as it has developed over more than a century, has appropriated the prehistoric, pre-Iranian, and non-Iranian Paleolithic, Neolithic, Chalcolithic, Bronze, and Iron Age assemblages from sites across Azerbaijan, Kurdistan, Luristan, Khuzestan, Fars, Kerman, Baluchistan, Khorasan, the Central Plateau, and the Circum-Caspian provinces within the boundaries of modern Iran, and deemed them the subjects of Iranian archaeology and ancient history. One may well ask, though, in what sense are the Neolithic levels at Ganjdare and Luristan Iranian, or the Bronze Age levels at Konar Sandal South in Jiroft? The short answer to this question is, in no sense. We are fully justified in designating the totality of the prehistory of the Iranian plateau and its immediately adjacent lands, Western Asian or ancient Near Eastern, but to call it Iranian is to make a leap of faith and to impose a much later concept on sites and finds dating to periods in which the concept of Iranianness simply did not exist. Nevertheless, by this definition, at least half of my lectures dealing with prehistoric and Elamite evidence will concern the pre-Iranian periods in the region. The focus here on aspects of kinship, which I have justified in part because they have been understudied and often misunderstood, also needs a few words of further explanation. Kinship is a venerable term in anthropology and ethnology, and it has a tendency to conjure up traditional, primitive, or tribal societies, all deeply flawed terms, which we somehow know were different than complex agricultural and urban societies. Kinship triggers in some an expectation that the societies in which it is important have a seemingly endless array of terms, from mothers, brothers, sisters, sons, and so forth. Kinship, visualized and concretized as a series of diagrams of marriage patterns, descent groups, and moieties, have been dear to the hearts of many a Victorian and early 20th century scholar. Yet kinship is just as much with us today as it was with our predecessors in the past. It constitutes a lens through which society can be studied, and it will be the principal arc through the lectures that I give over the next 10 days. This is not to say that competing forms of allegiance and group membership that cross-cut biologically or socially based units and were not strictly based on kin relations haven't also played their part in human history. But it is important to move beyond simple characterizations of kinship ties as the glue that bound pre-modern societies together, and to seek to understand those specific situations and institutions alluded to in ancient sources that have too often in previous scholarship been treated as aberrations, largely because of an ignorance of comparative cases from later periods and other cultures around the world. I do not intend, however, to present a catalog of kinship terms in Elamite, Old Persian, and Middle Persian, along the lines of Oswald Zemirani's 1977 monograph on Indo-European kinship terminology, or R.S.P. Beeks's detailed analysis of terms for uncle and nephew in the Indo-European and Proto-Indo-European languages. Instead, I've tried to identify cases which illustrate a particular principle recognized in the anthropology of kinship, but which have been overlooked or misunderstood. Some of these cases are attested only once in our admittedly fragmentary source material from the past. Others occur repeatedly, suggestive of a pattern of kin-related practice which, far from unique, is attested in other cultures around the world as well, even if this has not always been recognized. The scope ranges from prehistory, when the evidence is certainly sparse and always equivocal as well as controversial, to late antiquity. Without wishing to be too didactic in the remainder of this opening lecture, I think it is important to begin by clarifying certain general concepts that will be illustrated with specific cases from Iranian history in the days to come. With respect to what David Schneider termed the universe of kinship, no concepts are more basic than filiation and descent. Although often used interchangeably, these terms are not synonymous and are often used incorrectly in the historical literature. While the Oxford English Dictionary defines filiation as the fact of being the child of a specified parent, filiation is necessarily bilateral, or as some scholars prefer to say, equilateral. As the British anthropologist Meyer Fortes noted over 60 years ago, filiation is essentially the bond between successive generations. Descent, on the other hand, as Fortes stressed, can be defined as a genealogical connection recognized between a person and any of his ancestors or ancestresses. Filiation and descent, he went on, are two analytically distinct institutions. In surveying the literature, it is clear that many French and German-speaking authors, at least in the archaeological, Assyriological world, have not observed the strict distinction between filiation and descent used by Anglophone anthropologists. The same applies to Goya's aquatant, La Filiación. Describing the scene, the 19th century Spanish scholar and Goya expert Valentin Cardarera wrote, quote, "Here it is a matter of fooling the suitor by showing him in the record of nobility who the young lady's parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and great-great-grandparents were." But as he noted, vain people pretend to descend from great men when their distant relatives are barely known, and it takes a pair of spectacles even to see what is close by. The misuse of filiation here, when descent is in fact meant, as in Cardarera's notes, is representative of exactly what Edmund Leach tried to clarify in a paper addressing Claude Lévi-Strauss's use of the term filiation rather than descendance. And as I've observed in works by some Assyriologists, filiation is used sometimes synonymously with or in place of the term descent, as understood in the Anglophone anthropological literature, when in fact German Filiation should be distinguished from descendants. The difference between these terms is, moreover, extremely important. As David Schneider emphasized, filiation originates in the domestic domain, descent in the politico-jural domain, and descent has to do with a category of culturally differentiated statuses, some of which are abstracted from a genealogical mesh or a universe of kinsmen defined by a particular culture and constituted as a single conceptual category. In Marshall Sahlins' opinion, descent is not recruitment, but arrangement and alignment. In the first place, a principle of political design, exercising arbitrary constraints on the suppositions of ancestry. Descent may be unilineal, either patrilineal or matrilineal, determined through the line of male or female ancestors, or bilineal, bilateral, determined through both ancestral lines. In questions of succession and inheritance, Meyer Fortes noted, descent establishes what might be called a right to a place in the queue of potential successors. But we would do well to bear in mind what Marshall Sahlins wrote over 50 years ago. In major territorial descent groups, there is no particular relation between the descent ideology and group composition. The ideology of descent has a career of its own, largely independent of internal contradiction in recruitment. Facts of life overcome norms of membership. And if the facts be known, the ancestry is mixed. Purity of lineage has been undone. Therefore, a serious objection is in order to the popular tactic of perceiving structural principle, jural rule, as the outcome of how people are associated on the ground and in fact. In the conventional wisdom, structure is the precipitate of practice, but immediately we shift our sights to the major descent system, the received wisdom falls to the ground. This perspective will be helpful when we turn to the question of matrilinearity in ancient Iran, specifically in Elam, a topic on which simplistic conclusions have frequently been drawn based on evidence which, instead of testifying to the uniqueness of Elamite social structure, simply needed to be understood in light of comparative evidence from around the world. One aspect of kinship systems that has gone largely unrecognized in most studies of Elamite, Achaemenid, Arsacid, and Sasanian society is the very important distinction between what Lewis Henry Morgan termed classificatory versus descriptive kinship terminology. And although a voluminous literature, much of it critical, has sprung up since the 19th century on the validity of this distinction, the fundamental utility of it remains, as argued cogently by Leslie White and Meyer Fortes, amongst others. To put it simply, classificatory relations are socially, not biologically defined. As Elman Service emphasized 60 years ago, no one has succeeded in showing that there is in fact a simple direct correlation between an actual genealogical form of a society and a particular kind of kinship terminology. Or, to paraphrase Radcliffe Brown, kinship terms are used in address and reference as denotative of social positions relevant to interpersonal conduct. They are therefore a form of status terminology. Thus, if we think of words for father or son as status terms, as words designating a class of individuals occupying simultaneously or serially a single position in the social system, with specific defining patterns of rights and duties, the fulfillment of which is legitimized and guaranteed by sanctions, as Monroe Edmondson wrote, then kinship terminology is a category within status terminology, and kinship terms are status terms, which are familistic, in contrast to titles like lord, master, or doctor, which are non-familistic. In other words, fathers, mothers, sisters, and brothers are not exclusively biologically defined. As Morgan noted in describing the Malayan system, my father's brother is my father, his son and daughter are my brother and sister, and I apply to them the same terms I do to my own brothers and sisters. My father's sister, in like manner, is my mother. Her children are my brothers and sisters. My mother's brother is my father, and his children and descendants follow in the same relationships as in the previous cases. To cite another example, among the Talensi of northern Ghana, as Jack Goody noted, where sister can refer to clan females as a whole, the rule of exogamy is so strong that a taboo exists against marrying even distantly related classificatory sisters. As we shall see in a later lecture, this distinction between biological and socially constituted parents and siblings has enormous implications for our understanding of many situations attested in ancient sources, which have led Western commentators to naively assume that every reference to a father, mother, brother, or sister implies the narrow biological definition as it would, generally speaking, in modern Western societies. If that simplistic equivalence is stripped away, then many problems can be resolved that have plagued scholars for centuries. For example, in the case of Elamite kingship, Elamite kings like Huttulutush in Shushinak, who refers to himself as the son of three different forebears. In the same way, when descent is viewed as an organizing principle, then the question is not whether a family tree is fabricated or falsified, a charge that has sometimes been leveled at certain ancient Iranian rulers, nor is the issue at stake genealogical amnesia versus accurate recording. Rather, descent is a blueprint of recruitment and inclusion. To quote Marshall Solins again, the ideology of descent has a career of its own, largely independent of internal contradictions in recruitment. We should keep this perspective in mind when we look at some of the Elamite and Old Persian evidence, in particular for, as Meyer Fortes pointed out, paraphrasing Malinowski, quote, a genealogy is in fact a legal charter and not an historical record. This sounds like a sentiment to which Darius the Great would have concurred. Turning now to preferential marriage patterns, these are often intimately linked to kinship, and they shall feature in several of my lectures. A favorite topic of anthropologists all over the world, like kinship studies in general, preferential marriage patterns have received less attention in the study of Near Eastern antiquity, except it seems, when it comes to incest or so-called next of kin marriages. Two forms of preferential marriage have generated an enormous body of literature since the 19th century. These are so-called cross-cousin and parallel cousin marriage. Cross-cousins, a term coined by E.B. Tyler, are the children of siblings of the opposite sex, that is, brothers and sisters, whereas parallel cousins are the children of siblings of the same sex, that is, a set of brothers or a set of sisters. This classification is linked to the concept of the moiety, since cross cousins are by definition members of opposite halves or moieties of a group, whereas parallel cousins are always members of the same half, like siblings. For Tyler, cross-cousin marriage was part and parcel of exogamy, and exogamy, he felt, was the surest means of building alliances for social groups faced with, quote, the simple practical alternative between marrying out and being killed out. But it is also the case that marriage preferences are rarely strictly binary. Adam Cooper noted what all of us have probably observed in our own social circles, quote, sustained alliances between a few families in the same ecological niche gave the members of these clans a powerful competitive advantage. But as Malinowski's South African student Isaac Shapera observed in the case of the Swana of Botswana, while cross-cousin marriage was preferred, any cousin would do. And although matrilateral cross-cousin marriage was common throughout Swana society, Swana nobles opted, when possible, for patrilateral parallel cross-cousin marriage, that is, with the father's brother's daughter. As Adam Cooper noted, in both cases, the reason was very similar. Men tried to reinforce relationships with powerful kin. For a commoner, these were often mother's brothers. For a noble, the best placed relatives would be father's brothers. In fact, there's perhaps no better illustration of this, as Cooper pointed out, than the Rothschild family. Between 1824 and 1877, he noted, marriages were contracted by 36 patrilineal descendants of the founder of the House of Rothschild, that is Meyer Amschel Rothschild. 30 of these men and women married cousins, of whom 28 were first or second cousins related through the male line only. In other words, 78% of the marriages were with a father's brother's daughter, that is, parallel cousins, or a father's brother's son's daughter. These marriages were arranged in order to sustain the partnership between the 5 branches of the family, and they ceased abruptly when the rise of Prussia and the institution of joint stock companies changed the banking environment. This is just a foretaste of some of the topics we'll be considering over the next week or so. Everything from succession and endogamy to dowry, bride price, residence, the definition of tribe, patronymics, the avunculate, agnation, the leveret, feudalism, and tamgas. As I said at the beginning of this lecture, my aim is not to provide a catalog of terms or an exhaustive inventory of all kin-related data in ancient Iran, but rather to highlight instances in the sources where I believe more can be said by drawing on the insights of many of the giants of social anthropology, as well as data from non-Iranian historical and literary studies. This is not a question of privileging anthropology over the diverse branches of ancient Iranian studies, simply of using insights from anthropology to hopefully bring about a better understanding of some of the Iranian data that may have gone unnoticed or underappreciated over the years. I hope that this will be as interesting to you in the listening and eventually reading as it has been to me in the preparation. Thank you.